Hello everyone, welcome to our first recording for Working Lives in the Coal Mines. We'll do this one at the end of week 2 and another one at the end of week 4. And Arthur and myself will keep going through the comments as we can and catching up with what you're saying. So thanks very much to those of you who are leaving comments and engaging, and to those of you taking the course and lurking and reading the comments. It's been some quite lively discussion going on. And it's really good this year to see lots of people who've got memories of coal mining or family heritage in coal mining or experience of the industry, as well as those of you who are just interested and excited by the topic. So Arthur's going to mostly cover some issues that came up in week 1, and then I'll say a bit about comments on child mining in week 2. So one interesting issue that was raised, comes up a lot on all these courses actually, is wages and pay. So I think you were looking to this, Arthur?
Yeah. Who asked this? David asked about miners' wages and factory workers' wages, and what the difference was between them. And it's not an easy question to answer for the 19th century, because we don't have all that much data, and what data we have is scattered all over the place. And I suppose that's the first key point to make, and that is that the wages differed across both sectors, actually across the UK, but perhaps particularly in relation to coal mining. So particular regions or coal fields come into the equation. But there were a couple of wage surveys in the late. One in the late 19th century in 1886 and one in 1906. And the 1906 one is pretty comprehensive. The 1886 one isn't that good. Not many employers responded to it. But in short, the 1906 census gave the average wages for coal mining at something like 50 to 60% higher than the average wages in cotton textile factories. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the position of coal miners in the, if you like, working class wage league table by just before First World War.
I think
and they are pretty high up. They're pretty high up.
I mean, certainly in the mid-Victorian period, which is what I'd know more about, the hewers, the people working at the coalface, were considered some of the higher paid industrial workers. But of course, there's such a wide range of work in coal mining. And of course, like the textile industry, it's piecework. So you're paid by what you can achieve during the day, not a set rate. And I remember we were saying this about railway wages as well. There's such a, there's a complicated system of fines. There's a complicated system of the other things that might be involved in your wages, like housing or, credit at the local shop, or all the kind of amenities supplied by the mines that you're funding.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So that somewhat higher wage rate wouldn't have looked quite so good in the miners in terms of real wages and what the miners actually had in their hand. There's also the deductions for things like explosives and oil and such like, and of course the rent to pay. Okay, they did get free coal, but that was about it. And similarly to, I suppose, in textiles, you've got this hierarchy too. So at the very top of the tree in textiles, I suppose you would have workers like the cardroom strippers and grinders, the craftsmen and the spinners, and then moving down through the weavers and the tenters and the piecers down to labourers. And similarly in mining, the hewers would have been pretty much top of the tree, apart from the supervisors. And then you've got slightly lower paid haulage workers, and then the lesser paid surface workers. And of course, worth bringing gender in here too, as women's pay was particularly poor in mining, very low rates compared to male workers. And I think, Kirstie, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, there was gender was also significant in textiles, particularly in weaving, where
definitely
tended to get the better quality work, the larger looms, in weaving, this sort of thing, compared to many women.
Yeah, I mean, both of them, gender and age at both ends of the spectrum. Children are paid less, and older people, who are of course still in work in a period with no old age pensions or security, might tend to be paid less. Yeah.
And I suppose it wasn't only a sort of one-way process through the 19th century, early 20th century too. I mean, wages in mining would have fluctuated with with the price of coal under the old sliding scale. And whilst the 1910s were a good decade when miners' wages were high and continued to grow, miners were in demand during the Second World War, and wages peaked around 1919, 1920. That was followed by a period in the 20s and 30s when miners fell down the wage league table as wage cuts were imposed in the Depression.
Yeah, so that's us saying it's all very complicated.
But a great question, one that.
At no point were you able to lead what we would now consider a comfortable lifestyle on mining wages, really. It might have been tempting to you if you were, say, a young man in agriculture, or if you were in a factory town. It's possible you could have got paid more by going off and being a hewer, and many people did that. They moved in and out of the different industries.
Yep.
But yeah, in none of these are you living a nice middle class lifestyle on your pay.
No, don't think so.
Some people were asking about accidents and accident rates as well.
Yeah, Kirstie, there's a couple of questions on this. James Hogg asked about accident trends in the 20th century beyond the course, and Anne Holloway. How does the accident rate compare nowadays with 1947? So I suppose both questions extending beyond our chronological period.
That's your expertise.
I don't know about that, Kirstie, but great questions. The accident rate in mining, as in most industries, fell in the 20th century and fell quite sharply. Statistically, I can never quite get my tongue around that. Between 1900 and 1950, the first half of the 20th century, accident rates fell by about, accident death rates, which are much more reliable than the injury rates, fell by about down to about a third of their level, or fell by 3 times. So whatever the rate it was in 1900, the accident rate had fallen threefold by 1950 or thereabouts. But in the second half of the 20th century, as you might expect, accident mortality rates, deaths in industrial accidents, fall about tenfold. So the rate in and around 2000, at the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, was about 1/10 of the rate, and that's per 100,000 workers. It's not just a factor of the collapse and decline of these sectors. I guess a whole bunch of things come in there: new technology, mechanization, the importance of the union, state intervention, public attitudes and opinions. But yeah, so a substantial decline, as you might expect, in the accident rate.
But then it's interesting you say, of course, that we know about all the accidents that resulted in death, but we don't know about all the daily wear and tear that was just considered normal. I'm thinking about this because it came up again in the railways course, or about the accidents that were considered minor at the time, but wouldn't be considered minor in a workplace now.
Yep, I'm sure, because a lot of that would have gone unrecorded in the 19th century, and even in the workman's comp era, from the 1890s on, the workman's compensation era, a lot of the minor accidents would have been underreported. There was a bit of an issue in the 1920s and 30s with sepsis that the mines inspectors put down to miners, just ignoring, as we might expect. Miners were socialized into high levels of danger and injury, but ignoring the minor cuts and abrasions that then went septic. But others, a couple of other learners were asking about lung diseases and comparisons between lung disease rates of textile workers and coal mines. Clearly, these are students, of course, that did your textile workers course beforehand, or have done in the past. And it's great to see those comparisons actually coming through. Railway workers and textile workers being compared with mining work experience. But Jane and Gillian were discussing this, and but I just thought it's worth putting in perspective. The bisonosis, brown lung, was significant in textile factories, particularly in the card room, the early preparatory stages. Dust levels decline a bit as you get into the spinning room, and decline a bit more, I think, when you get into the weaving shed. But if you compare pneumoconiosis rates Byssinosis was a pneumoconiosis, basically a clogging up of the lungs with the inhalation of dust. If you compare byssinosis rates brown lung with black lung rates are much higher. It's a much more disabling type of respiratory ailment, and mortality rates are much higher. So while certainly many workers in the Victorian era and into the 20th century are exposed to very high levels of dust at work, and that inhalation of whatever fibers or dust in the atmosphere could clog up the lungs. Coal workers pneumoconiosis, black lung, is of a somewhat different degree, I think, to brown lung.
Yeah, and I think that is recognised at the time as such a major hazard, in a way that textile workers didn't always really recognise what they were experiencing as life-threatening in the same way. Yeah, that's good. Really helpful.
And finally, on bodies that I could pick up in the questions, comments. Anyway, Peter Sanford asked this question. It seems that some mines employed doctors and provided medical treatment, but healthcare was by no means universal in pre-NHS days. Is that a correct interpretation? Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes, Peter. That it was mostly part-time GPs, doctors, company doctors that were covering pits, but very much on a part-time basis, and very uneven and patchy across the country. And just to give you some idea, there was a survey in 1944, just checking my notes here to make sure I get this right, in 1944, so towards the end of the Second World War, and at that point, there were 176 full-time company doctors across the whole of the British economy, not just the coal mines, but the whole of the British economy, and about 700 part-time doctors. And the really key change, I think, as you rightly recognise, as Peter rightly recognises, the key change came with nationalisation and the formation of the Mines Medical Service, which by the 1950s was certainly the most comprehensive occupational medical service across British industries. It employed 65 full-time doctors, 300 nurses, and had a chief medical officer.
So prior to then, you're kind of at the mercy of, are you working for a good company that has actually hired a doctor, and is that a good doctor? And as I think Robert Smiley points out in his autobiography, it's also where the doctor lives. Like, they're not much good to you if, something terrible has happened to you down the mine and they're 15 miles away, 3 villages off, then yeah. And of course,
yeah, most definitely,
the rest of the time you're just reliant on there being a local doctor, and you're paying for the doctor to see you, as was the case in the whole Victorian period, unless you were in a charity hospital, in effect. You were paying for any healthcare.
Yep, I think that point you're making there, Kirstie, is a really important one. And brings us back to a point that's cropped up in a lot of the comments, actually, about the diversity across coalfields, and even down to individual companies and pits, and I think we see this in terms of occupational health and safety coverage. Some companies were much more, if you like, humane and humanitarian and decent and welfarist and paternalist than others. I think I mentioned in response to one of the comments the East Fife Coal Company were considered to be more welfarist than probably the majority of coal owners in the 19th century. So I think there is a range of maybe positions and strategies on occupational health provision amongst the colliery companies, with some good ones and probably the majority of coal owners who weren't really that interested in miners' bodies, at least until well into the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of on to week 2, because there were a lot of outraged comments, rightly outraged, saying, well, who was making all this money off the exploitation, in particular of children and young people in the mines, and where was the money going? Well, it was going to the coal owners, who were often the big landowners in the district, an aristocratic landowner, like, I've forgotten his name, but you probably know, Arthur, the Hamilton Duke, whose house collapsed the giant Hamilton Palace. So it's
Can't help you there, Kirstie. No,
double check this. But the major landowners in Hamilton outside Glasgow, where they had a lot of mines on their land, I always liked them because their giant palace, Hamilton Palace, that collapsed due to subsidence in the mine shafts. I'll have to look that up and give you all a link because it's a good story of dramatic irony, I suppose. But a lot of the money was going to people who were very hands-off, I suppose is what I would say in the 19th century. You know, there were mines in your land and you employed people to work them, but you yourself were not directly involved in the business of mining necessarily. But of course, as we were just saying, that wasn't always true. There were some mine owners who cared about the welfare of the workers, who put a lot of effort into schools, reading rooms, institutes, healthcare, and so forth. It really, really varied. There was nobody making you be a good paternalist, charitable mine owner, or, you know, down to the level of individual mine managers and foremen. But there was nobody stopping you from doing it if you felt it was your Christian duty or responsibility. And the wider commentary on week 2 and on children in the mines is really, really interesting. And I think the most interesting question that you're all raising in your discussions is, do we look at this through 21st century eyes? Because obviously when we read these accounts, they're so moving and so distressing. You know, as many of you rightly pointed out, here we are being distressed by 19th century accounts when the same things are indeed occurring in other places in the world today in relation to child labour. Always something that it's good for people to be thinking about around these courses and that learners really do think about. But are we looking at it through 21st century eyes? So I've been thinking about this, and yeah, we do really need to recognise that in the 19th century, child labour is standard. So for instance, a lot of the Victorian people I work on, they would have been in the Scottish countryside, and at 8 or 9, you would have started work and you would have been working quite often as a herd boy or in the fields in some capacity. So if your choice is sitting in the mines all day opening a door, like the little trappers we were reading about, or out in a freezing field in the Scottish winter with a bunch of cattle on your own, some people actually would have chosen the mine because at least it's warm. That's, you know, there are all these factors in relation to, you know, this is a society that just expects children to work, and they expect children to work because the family needs the money. The children themselves don't have the same concept of childhood as a protected space that is different, and where children need to be allowed to do things like play and socialize and learn. That's not in existence in the 1830s and 40s. So our whole understanding of what it means to be a child is very, very different. And there were some people, you know, raising questions about Septimus and working down the mine when you're 12, leaving school at 12, doing a full-time job by the time you're 14. But when you were 14, you were considered, in effect, an adult, really up until the 20th century. I guess perhaps in the period in which you've looked at mining, that might start to shift. You know, the age moves up and up, doesn't it?
Yep. No, I think that's a fair point, Kirstie.
Yeah. So I think we need to. I'm not saying child labour in the mines was good, because nobody could say that, and our outrage is completely justified. But it was the outrage that we feel was not shared by most people, and that's why the Commission reports are so striking and interesting in the way in which they frame what you should be outraged about. So a lot of you were saying, you know, why all these mentions of Sunday school and religion? Well, because that seemed like a bigger deal to the Victorians. You know, this was your eternal soul at stake if you weren't getting a religious education, whereas the fact that you were sitting in the mines in the dark all day at work, that was normal life, so to speak. I did enjoy your comments, actually, because I especially enjoyed all the comments saying about the hypocrisy of the masters sitting at their nice dinners and going to church every Sunday. And the reason why I enjoyed them is because that is exactly what the Victorians like Elizabeth Barrett Browning in her poem and other writers said when they read the Mining Commission reports. So it's a kind of echo across the centuries of what people who had not realised what conditions were like in the mines thought when they read those 1840s reports and why they were so striking. So I'm just monologuing here, Arthur, but do
No, it's fascinating.
monologuing
Fascinating
about
stuff.
the
And no, fascinating stuff. And really important that we don't apply hindsight in thinking about things in the earlier period of the 19th century, because it can distort things somewhat, I think. We need to try, and it's difficult though it is, try and imagine ourselves in that period.
Yeah, and there was a good question which was about girls in the mines in the period when they worked there, and about experiencing puberty in the mines, all these teenage girls working on difficulties of that. I thought that was a good question, because it's a question about the kinds of health and things surrounding bodies that we don't know and that we can't find out about. So it made me think about how in the handwritten unpublished manuscript by Septimus about working down the mine, he says one of the things that worried me was there were no toilets down the mine. What was I gonna do for 8 hours? But nobody says anything about that in the commission reports, do they? Because those are all mediated by the commissioners. So even if the people interviewed had felt that they could talk about bodily functions in particular ways, or in the case of all the young women, about things like sexual assault and abuse that we know was almost certainly happening, but even if they discussed it, it would have been censored out before the reports appeared. So there are all these things that were known to the workers themselves that will never be known to us, because we have no way of retrieving those memories before the period of oral history. And I guess before the period of oral history, when people would be open about these things, even in an oral history interview.
Yep. Even in the Old Testament, you rarely get miners talking about toilet facilities or lack of underground. One or two of the learners commented on the assault on the senses of in relation to working the mine in the 19th century, the issues with poor illumination and nystagmus as a consequence, and noise, particularly with the coming in of mechanization that Bert Coombs talks about in a very evocative way. But what you don't get mentioned very much is what would have been the stench down the mine, linked to the lack of toilet facilities, and maybe even the animal life underground. Canaries, horses, ponies, vermin.
We're looking at what writings the workers left behind and what was written about them. It is really interesting to think about what we're not learning about, as well as what's been left for us to learn about. There was some really interesting commentary about the songs and poetry this week as well, which are, one of the reasons we turn to literary sources is when there's not much else that tells us about life in the mines, but also to think about how literature can or cannot represent things in certain ways. So as always, it's really intriguing just to see a mix of comments saying, for instance, on Patience Kershaw's testimony, some people say, well, the song makes it more powerful and moving. And some people say, well, the song, falsifies in some sense or misrepresents the direct words of Patience, or doesn't strike me in the same way. And some people really enjoy thinking about a kind of creative writing exercise. We actually just had some of our students here doing this, and some of them did amazing work, where you're thinking, if I had to write something about children in the mines, what would I write? And I'm not sure if any of you this year, but every year we do have some people saying, well, I just can't even think about that because I feel like that's wrong just to consider how to represent and experience that bad. So it's really interesting and important to think about how creative works by the miners and by other people agitating on behalf of miners feed into our historical perceptions and the kind of things that they were trying to do, and whether they work or not.
Yep, and there'll be more on that, I guess, over week 3 and week 4, Kirstie, as we move on.
And I think most of the issues that came up. Was there anything else we've missed?
There was one of the there was that issue raised by Peter in relation to modern coal mine and the use of disused mines, Kirstie, which I know you're involved in that project. You might want to comment on that.
Yes, so Strathclyde has a huge project. We're just waiting to see if the government funds it or not. Cross your fingers. Called Hotscot, about developing the potential for mine water geothermal in the central belt in Scotland. because one of the exciting and intriguing possibilities for disused mines is, to put this in very lay, not scientific terms, that you can pump the hot water out of them and use it to heat homes in the local mining communities. And that's environmentally friendly because you can circulate the water around. But I'm involved in that project because the very enlightened engineers and geologists at Strathclyde realise that there are a lot of issues here around what a former mining community thinks about the disused mines. For instance, suppose the scientists show up and propose that they're going to heat your houses using the water from a mine shaft, where there are bodies in that mine shaft that were never recovered from an accident 100 years ago. So there is an emotional heft to that we need to take into account, rather than just going in and saying, you know, here we are with our new pumps and this great environmentally friendly plan, let's go. But there are also really positive things for mining communities in that this is a very local form of new energy that can be a really exciting way of providing cheap heat to communities in post-industrial areas and kind of making that industrial heritage come back to life again for this new carbon neutral society we're hoping to head towards. So it's very, very interesting. And should we get the funding, many exciting things would be happening.
Very good, and great that that COP is in Glasgow in November. Links into all that. Hopefully the grant will be awarded by then, and cracking stuff. I did ask. We've got in week 4, folks. We have one of the sources we use is an interview with the miners' president, Nicky Wilson. I did ask Nicky Wilson his position on this and thoughts on this, and he was very keen and supportive, and yeah, so very exciting stuff.
Yeah, it's exciting possibilities afoot for mining heritage. Okay, so please feel free to leave us any further questions this raises. Keep the discussion coming, and we'll follow along, and we will see you again in this format at the end of week 4. Thank you.
And just wanted to reiterate what Kirstie said at the beginning. Some brilliant comments. Wonderful to hear your stories, particularly personal stories from folk in mining communities. It's a really wonderful sharing of those stories. One that sticks in my mind actually is Jackie and Linda's conversation around the serious accidents that their fathers had in the 1960s. That led, I think, Jackie into a career in physiotherapy. Both of them speaking to the importance of rehab and how rehab was really developed in mining communities in the late 19th, early 20th century. So wonderful comments. Folks really enjoyed reading them. I look forward to the next couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Cheers.